Aloha, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Triple F Podcast, Faith and Family First. On this episode, Jim Hochberg and I are going to be talking about a recent report that describes what the bodies in the pews look like and why there's a decline. So if you want to know why less people are going to church every week, you want to stay tuned. So let's chat about that. Jim, welcome back.
Thank you. Welcome back yourself.
Yeah, it's always good to be across the table from you, as I like to say. So today, Jim, I sent you two big reports. And so the show we're going to do today and the show we're going to do next are where we're going to discuss these two reports. And I know that you love it when I give you a lot of reading to do, don't you? You do. You live for that.
Yeah.
But
I like to read.
But I did ask.
I'm a good reader, you know.
You're actually a very good conversationalist too, so thank you for that. But what was interesting to you when I sent, or what was interesting to me when I sent these to you was that it kind of ties in, the reason that I sent them is because it kind of ties into what we've been talking about over the last several shows. So the report we're going to talk about today is a nationwide study entitled Faith and Relationships that was revised for fall 2023 by a group called Communio.
But tell everybody the name of the person that authored it. J.P.
DeGance.
Yeah, I thought that was kind of fun.
Okay.
Say it like 10 times.
Well, I don't want to do that. Okay, so this particular study, which we will provide the link for those of you that want to, as Jim and I always say, we're going to talk about what jumped out in the report to us, but we want you to take a look at the report, especially if you are a church leader. If you're a church leader, you want to look at this because I found it very fascinating that they're talking about why everyone has been talking about less people have been going to church. COVID was a big It was a big shift.
It was going down.
It was going down
anyway.
already, but COVID kind of sealed the fate there, so to speak. And so this study wanted to look at who is continuing to go to church and what this portrait looks like. And so that's what we're going to talk about today.
And the only thing that I feel obliged to mention is in the end times, which I think we are better than 50-50 chance in, there's going to be a remnant, which means most of the people are not believers. And we've been watching that in our own country, for a long time.
And I'm curious, for those of you that are watching right now on YouTube, take a moment to just pause the video and go down into the comments and tell us if you attend church. And if you attend church, tell us why you're continuing to go. But let us know if you're not going to church and maybe why you stopped going. And I think that would be a really great place to start.
And if you go occasionally,
tell us why.
that. If you go weekly, if you go more than weekly, monthly, whatever it is, what's your attendance habit?
Yep. If we get enough comments on that, Jim and I will do a show to talk about you, our viewers and listeners. So, Jim, the report begins they always give their summary, right, about
Correct.
what the study is going to be about. And they talk about how in the last 40 years, there's been a steady decline in the number of people that are attending church. And they said this in the beginning, which I think is really important, and it will kind of give a foundation for what we're going to talk about. And so I'm quoting directly from the report: family decline appears to fuel faith decline. This study concludes that the overall population of the religious nuns, those are people that are now claiming that they don't have any religious affiliation, is unlikely to stabilize until 25 to 30 years after family structure has stabilized.
And I highlighted that myself. And I wrote next to it, optimism. Now, why would I be optimistic about that?
Because that sounds depressing to me.
Well, you're an Eeyore, and I'm a Winnie the Pooh. That's why.
Well, thank you. Is it a compliment? No.
Let me explain it. Because I'm not that optimistic. I think it's going to continue growing, the nuns. Not the habit nuns, but the don't go to church nuns, the non-religious, is going to continue to grow. I don't see it stabilizing and being reduced. I think it's a downhill slope like a snowball. So when I read that, I thought, boy, that's pretty optimistic.
It jumped off the page for me because I thought, wow. So even if everyone who's listening and viewing right now says, let's jump in and let's make a difference. I may not even see this change in my lifetime, and that's depressing to me.
Well, it may not happen because Jesus might come back in the meantime.
Come, Lord Jesus, come. Okay. So they also talk about in the summary, they get into, and Jim and I will break down some of this a little bit more, but they talk about the loneliness of churchgoers, which was shocking to me. So now they're talking about people that are actually attending church that are lonely. And they say that 22% of churchgoers are considered lonely, and approximately half of all U.S. adults are experiencing loneliness. And it was really interesting because later on in there, when they talk about where the studies come from, they actually they talk about how our Surgeon General has talked about the growth of loneliness in the population over several years. And it horrified me to think that there's even one person who's sitting in the church on the weekend that might be lonely.
What occurred to me is, how do they know? How do you know who's lonely and who's not lonely?
Because you asked the question, and people in a survey will say that they're you know what?
So how was it defined? Okay, you know what I'm saying?
Let's throw this out there because I think that we need to be raw in our shows so that people can understand that we practice what we preach. Okay, I'm one of those people. I am a single woman of a wonderful age that shall remain ageless.
I know what it is.
And I go to church, and I'm one of those people that are extremely lonely because I don't have a spouse. And my brothers, I have living brothers that are busy with their own lives. And so my whole excitement is either job or church, job or church, job or church. People like me are lonely. People like me don't have that extra, that you have with a couple. A couple that attend church together, they do things together. They have things outside of church and outside of work. And when we look at the numbers they're providing, we know that marriage is on a big decline. There are less and less people getting married, and there's more and more people that are cohabitating.
So are they lonely because they're not married, or are they not lonely because they're cohabitating?
No, according to this study, it says cohabitators far more likely to struggle than married. And the reason for that, we'll have Glenn Stanton back on the show one time because he actually talks about this, the cohabitation and what that means in the church. The reason is that studies have shown that women are hurt greatly when they cohabitate. Women hurt great.
It's the free milk and the cow,
No, and I tell you what, there was a statement in here. It really bothered me when you look at the danger of kids, right? So when they're talking about cohabitation, right, they talk about a child has a certain safety net when they have a married, committed mother and father and they're living in that home. So when you have two people who are not committed to each other, they're just living together. This is, and I'm quoting directly now, that the more ACEs, which is that adverse childhood experience, the more ACEs a child experiences, the greater the likelihood the child will live in poverty, suffer depression, commit a violent crime, or struggle in his life as an adult.
But you know what? I think we want to be a little bit careful to assume just because two people that are living together didn't get married that they're not committed, because they're actually... It's a
false commitment. And the reason I say that is because two people who living together are not married, one can take off for any reason at any time.
True, but if they're both committed, they don't.
But it doesn't matter. Well, no, but if they're
people
committed,
can get divorced at any time.
But that's the point. The point is, if they're committed, why aren't they married then?
Maybe they don't believe in the institution for political reasons.
We're talking about people in the church. People that are attending this report.
I wasn't talking about your study. I was just saying we don't want to just state that if you're not married, you're not committed.
So people outside the church, maybe. But people, that's the question we have to ask. If people are attending church every week and they say they're in a committed relationship, but they're cohabitating, first of all, the dangers that provides to a child, because a lot of times what they're showing is that these cohabitating couples are the woman with her biological children that she had from a prior relationship, And the man that's raising these kids are not the biological father. And that's the danger on some of those kids. In fact, I want to find that quote because...
But while you're looking for that, some theologians in some religions don't permit second marriages. There are faiths that don't permit second marriages unless certain rituals are gone through for pretending like the first marriage never happened.
Yeah, but I will tell you
that there can be a lot of very committed people that aren't married.
Even those churches.
Going to church.
Even those churches that have that kind of theology that, okay, you have to, they all have steps, though, of how to make it right. How can you be in church in this relationship and receive the church's blessing or whatever? All churches have that. All religions have that. So
you know all of them? How many are there?
I know
How many
because
could there be? 300?
There's tons. But I will say, again, we are talking about this particular study that talks about the children of these relationships and how they're best served. And you as an attorney should know darn well.
I don't do any family law.
Yeah, but what is the legal recourse that a woman has if she's lived with a husband or lived with a man for 10 years she's not married to?
Depends on where she lives. In Hawaii, not much.
That's what I'm
In other states, a lot.
Yeah, well, if they can claim common law. But we're talking about Hawaii, and we don't have anything like that.
Correct.
So here in Hawaii,
but I think actually, you know what? I think the introduction into the law of same-sex marriage and reciprocal beneficiaries was a radical move away from the historical Hawaii legal view of marriage as its own thing. So I don't know exactly how that would work out now.
Well, I can tell you that what we were told when we were fighting same-sex marriage at the time, that this was going to help marriage, right? There were going to be more marriages now, right? And
well, there were a couple.
I remember at the time there were some leaders in some of the churches that actually came out and said this is going to hurt marriage. And I remember the quote. The quote was that marriage is going to include everything and mean nothing. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what happened. So even in committed LGBT couples now, they're not even getting married. So there are some that choose that. But marriage is we're talking marriage now, no matter how you define it, it's dropped regardless.
Correct.
So the whole importance of marriage needs to be embraced by the church. The church needs to start preaching to these younger generations, because that's talked about in here, the difference between how the younger generation is viewing marriage and relationships and how the older ones are. And they need to hear why. Why is marriage? And again, to be raw, I have a daughter who is cohabitating and has been cohabitating for a very long time. She doesn't want to get married. She says, why should I? What is the benefit?
You're proving my point. Thank you.
What? Yeah, but I also know because I just sat down with an insurance company on our house, right? And about who's covered and all of that. And I learned very quickly that in insurance coverage and all that, if there is no formal relationship, you get buffage. Portuguese people say buffage, which means nothing, nada. You get nothing. So again, you can throw out the word committed, but when it boils down to somebody could get hurt by this committed relationship.
Okay. So I want to talk to the pastors.
Because
you brought up a point that the pastors need to talk about the importance of marriage, and I agree.
Yes.
But what the pastors need to do first is be willing to risk unhappy hearers of that preaching. Mm-hmm. And pastors don't like to have unhappy hearers of their preaching, so they tend not to be as preachable as they should be, because they're supposed to be leading the congregation in the way they should live, not saying things that tickle their ears so that they keep coming back. And that's a big problem, I think, in the church.
No, it really is. And I mentioned Glenn Stanton earlier because he's done a lot of study.
His book was something like The
Ring
Ring
Makes All the Difference.
The Ring Makes All. You should get that book and read it. It's a little paperback. The Ring Makes All the Difference.
It does.
It's written to young women. It's a great book. In fact, he came out here right when he wrote it, he did some presentations for us.
He did, and so he's another one we can get back on the show to talk about this. But here's a quote from, they put in this report that actually comes from Glenn's book, okay? And here's the quote. Cohabitating is not only more dangerous for women, but also more dangerous for children. and this is the quote I really want people to listen to, the most unsafe living environment for any child is to live in a home with his mom and her cohabitating boyfriend.
Really?
Again, because this is not his child. It is not his biological child. And so when you look at things like domestic violence, abuse, neglect, it grows. I'm not saying that every person, again, so I'm glad you made that point. I mean, because I do know some good people that have chosen to cohabitate for whatever reason. But a child wants to grow up in a home where they know their mom and dad is committed more than just by saying with their mouth they're committed. There is something about celebrating an anniversary every year. There is something about looking at the wedding pictures. There's something about seeing the church part, in the background of these wedding pictures. You see people from your community that have stand up for you. You've been married twice. You know what it's like to have
First
a church.
time I got married, it came with 2 kids. So I was that stepfather dude. So that's why I'm surprised that it's an unsafe place.
Well, there are some great men and there are some not so great men. There are some great women. There are some not so great women. So we don't want to pick on either because
there are some that think they're the other, and that's just like bizarre.
Yep. And so going back to this report and talking about cohabitation, what they're claiming in this report is a cohabitating woman, and again, I'm quoting, cohabitating woman in church is almost twice as likely to report struggling in her relationship than a cohabitating man. So they asked these people who are attending church, these are people that are in the church that are cohabitating. The man is like, oh no, there's nothing wrong with our relationship.
What about the
great.
married couples? It's probably the same ratio.
It says, well,
guys are like,
it's
yeah,
not,
okay.
It is true that men in a married relationship, according to their statistics, also have less saying nothing's wrong. But that number is less than the cohabitating men. So you're right that it's like this, but it's, I think.
So if you were listening on the radio, you don't know what this was.
Oh yeah, I was moving my hands, my 2 hands to show that while men, whether they're cohabitating or whether they're married, both of them will say they report less problems in their marriage. But there's a wide difference between the cohabitating men and the married men. So
let me get to a point. Are you done with that one?
Yeah.
So one of the points I kind of jumped out at me because it sort of went without saying, but then having read it, it was like, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. The report reports that the link between marriage and faith is clear, meaning people that don't go to church aren't as likely to get married. Obviously, okay, sure, fine. But yet, 85% of all churches in the United States report spending $0 annually on marriage and relationship ministry, which I thought was kind of odd because I know the church, we go to 2 churches, a Calvary Chapel and Sacred Heart. And I know Calvary Chapel has all kind of marriage and women's ministries and all this kind of stuff. And I'm pretty sure Sacred Heart does, but I'm in the music ministry, so that's my focus over there. I was just surprised to see 0.
But did you look the reference though? Because normally on all of that stuff
there is a footnote.
Yeah, look at the footnote and see where they got that from in the very, very back. And while he's looking at that, when I want to go back is to that point on loneliness. So in 2017, the U.S. Surgeon General declared that America was experiencing an epidemic of loneliness. And moving to May 2023, half of all U.S. adults are experiencing loneliness, which I find that interesting that loneliness is growing where people are not going to church. You know what I mean? More and more people are not going to church, and so loneliness is growing. So I see a correlation between that. And I'm not saying that people that go to church don't experience loneliness, but I kind of find that very interesting that these are.
So that footnote about the church spending 0 on marriage ministry is from our friends Barna Group, a survey that they compiled in 2019 on the state of marriage and relationship ministry. So it's kind of old, but not that old.
And again, I'm sure even Barna would agree with this, that they didn't get to interview every single church that's in the United States. And so there probably are some churches that do spend some money.
Well, I mean, it's kind of a typical church function.
Well,
marriage ministry.
You and I talked a couple shows ago about motherhood, right? And we talked about how churches don't pour a lot of money into motherhood ministries. Now, they do have there are churches that have their childcare ministry, which is great. But to talk about this idea of mentoring and to put money into that, we do see that there is a disconnect in ministry. And I think that if I was a pastor and I was hearing all this, I would think this is the perfect time to really begin to promote marriage, but to be aware, like you said, that you're going to get pushback because we're listening.
There's a lot of people that will be offended by that, but maybe we're supposed to be offended, and that will indicate where our sin is or something. I don't know,
Well, again, maybe I'm putting on my Eeyore hat right now, but I'm not seeing any change in this in the next few years. In fact, I'm seeing that it's probably going to get worse.
So one of these things jumped out at me, and it made me do a little bit of research. Can I go there?
Yes, you may.
Okay. So it's talking about marriage decline preceded and fueled the decline of faith. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So then the sentence was, the sexual revolution, widely seen as beginning with the introduction of birth control pill in the United States in 1960, decoupled sex from marriage and transformed family. And I said to myself, that can't be true. 1960 cannot possibly be where decoupling sex from marriage and family started. So I did some research, and I found a PBS 700-page, no, I don't know how many pages this was, but there's it's a timeline on contraception. It's very interesting. Do you know, let me ask you, what year is it recorded that the first counseling to refrain from sex to avoid pregnancy?
I have no idea.
When did abstinence as a form of birth control start?
I don't know.
23 to 79 AD. Pliny, the Roman writer of natural history, counseled people to do that. So I was right. It goes kind of back a little further than 1960. When was it that there was a major scientific breakthrough that the scientists discovered the existence of the female egg, the ovum? When was that discovered?
You tell me.
Little sooner, 1827. Prior to that, it was only known that semen must enter the female body for conception to occur. This is the first step toward understanding the science of human reproduction. So this was a very interesting little rabbit hole I went off on. Then, have you ever heard of the Comstock Law?
Nope.
So listen to this. In 1873, 50 years after they discovered the ovum, Congress passed the Comstock Law, which was an anti-obscenity act that specifically listed contraceptives as obscene material and outlawed the dissemination of them via the Postal Service or interstate commerce.
Now, that thing about distributing it through interstate commerce, that came up recently, right? When they overturned Roe versus Wade, right? They talked about that.
So then when was it that scientists definitively concluded that for human fertilization to occur, there must be a union of an egg and a sperm? When did they catch that?
I don't know. You tell us.
1875, after the Civil War. It's very interesting stuff. When was the FDA started?
I don't know.
Do you know why?
Do I know why I don't know?
No. Do you know why it was started? So in 1906, the Food and Drug Administration was established to protect consumers from fraudulent medical products and quackery.
Oh, you mean back in the day where they would drive those medicine trucks around? Remember that?
Yes.
Well, I know you wouldn't remember them personally, but I'm talking about those times they had those elixirs, right? People were selling all those.
The snake oil.
Yeah, the snake oil.
Those were like horse-drawn carriages.
Well, it's around the same time of what you're quoting.
Correct. So I was curious. How did the pill make them say that 1960 was when sex got separated from
so something
marriage?
Must have happened.
Now, well, I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
Because that's also in here. So in 1960, when the pill came out, there were 1.2 million American women on the pill in 62. In 63, there were 2.3 million American women on the pill. In 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Griswold versus Connecticut.
That sounds familiar.
Yes, and there was a law in Connecticut that prohibited the use of birth control, and the Supreme Court said the interest in privacy, which is how Roe v. Wade came around. Okay,
right. Okay, that's
now
why.
Going up forward, 1967, 12.5 million women worldwide are on the pill. The sale of the pill in 1968 hit $150 million. In the 70s, there were these hearings in Congress about the efficacy and safety of the pill because they were worried about cancer and that kind of stuff. Sale of the pill in the 70s, because of those hearings, dropped by 20%. So I would say that my research proved to me that they're correct. That
well, I'm glad.
The pill,
I would have been very nervous had you came back and said
the pill in the 60s, 70s, 80s decoupled sex way more than anything else from marriage and transformed the family. I think it's true.
So how do you think this ties into the point of less bodies in the pews, since that's kind of what the overall arching message of this was? How do you think that's affected people going to church?
You know, it's a very interesting, very complicated question. I could say it's above my pay grade, but since I get paid to give my opinion on things, I'm going to tell you what I think, which is probably worth nothing, but I'll tell you anyway. I think when the church was the Universal Catholic Church and people didn't get divorced because they weren't supposed to, because they got married in the presence with the intertwining of the Holy Spirit. And
you made promises that you were going to raise your children in the faith. I mean, this was pretty serious stuff.
When that was the culture and people didn't get divorced, people went to church and they stayed married. Okay? And I think that the liberalization of the culture in the ways that made it my way instead of Scripture way is the problem. As long as I can choose my way, I can do whatever I want. I can still go to church if I want, or I can choose not to go to church if I don't want. I can live with somebody if I want. We're supposed to be serving Christ. And if we're doing our own thing, we need to think about that.
I agree. And I think this report, when it gets to the end and it starts talking about action items, right? If pastors and churches, and I'm quoting, fail to reestablish a cornerstone view of marriage among their people, this study demonstrates that the church will continue to shrink and many more souls will be lost. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're saying in this, is that the idea of marriage and commitment and what God says about marriage, because that's really what we're talking about, what the importance of marriage is to the church and why you need to stand up for it. So make sure that you like this video, share this video, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you know every time we upload a new video. And stay tuned, because next week we're going to look at how people view businesses and why that even affects the bodies that go to church. So thanks for joining us. Mahalo, everybody.
Aloha.